And the hot and dry conditions they're speaking of are having a devastating impact on crops in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley. Emily Lutz is the executive director of the Nova Scotia Fruit Growers Association, and she joins us this morning from Kentville. Good morning, Emily.
Good morning, Crystal. How are you?
I'm good this morning. I want to know how you're doing. Just how dry has it been for you in the valley these days?
Yeah, extraordinarily dry. I was chatting with one grower yesterday and he was sort of lamenting normally when you start August, it's been rainy in July and you're going into your dry season. Well, July has been so dry that we're starting the dry season with a huge rain deficit. So things are crunchy, they're crispy, and the trees are starting to show it.
Interesting. We saw some images from the valley. The ground looks very, very dry, and it looks like the apples, although they're beginning to form, are not as plump as they would be. They almost look dehydrated. How bad are the conditions with your apple crops?
Yeah, they're pretty bad. So, we're lucky in perennial fruit, so apples and peaches, that our trees are pretty big. They have, pretty big root systems. And so they're able to draw water from very deep in the ground, which, protects them through these long, long periods of dry. But that only goes so far. If you're really at this point, there's so little water that there's that little to draw from in the ground. So, we're seeing the trees start to show stress, which can look like, wilting leaves, the apples, not sizing up appropriately, the peaches shriveling, and this can not just impact this year's crop and this year's apple trees, but it can actually have impacts on the trees for years to come if they experience that much stress.
Interesting. That is interesting. This could have impacts into the future. We saw in the images there some irrigation happening. Are you using irrigation? Is there enough water in the water table to even do irrigation?
So some growers have irrigation because apples are so hardy and apple trees are generally so good at bringing up water from deep below the ground. Not a lot of farmers use irrigation. It's expensive to set up, and generally it has to be done when you plant your orchard. So some of our orchards are 10, 15, 20 years old. So that irrigation often needs to be put in at the very beginning of that planting. As we're seeing longer dry spells, I think more people are wishing they had irrigation. Those who do have it mostly have peaches. So those with peaches often have irrigation because water, when you think about a peach, it's mostly water. That's what makes apples and peaches so wonderful, is that water, that juiciness. And so without that, we're looking at a reduced crop. And so those with irrigation are pretty thankful that they have it. And I think those without are looking towards the future and saying, how can we mitigate some of the impacts of these really long dry spells that happen here in Nova Scotia?
Yeah. What's the next crop that's going to ripen in the region?
So we're doing peaches right now. So many of the peaches are coming on. They're looking smaller than normal, which can affect, of course, grower returns when, people want those nice, big, juicy peaches. And if they're not looking that great, it can affect, of course, the price, which then affects the farmer's bottom line, which then has a ripple effect into the rest of the season. So peaches go throughout August and into early September. And then in late August, we start seeing some of those early apple varieties, those Paula Reds. Into early September, we get some of the Sweet Tangos. And then into October, we get Honeycrisp. And then later in the season, we sort of finish with Pizzazz. So it is a long season. There's lots of time, hopefully, to get some rain and to see things improve. And as you can imagine, farmers are always checking the weather. So watching the weather forecast today, it's not surprising. I think people are feeling stressed but also, aware that it's going to be another couple of weeks before we may see some relief.
For sure. All right. No, we know that Nova Scotia is like the Honeycrisp hotbed of the world, and that's a huge export for you. When, like you said, you expected rain in a couple of weeks. Like, sort of, when is the point of no return where you could, if, for example, if it started to rain in 2 weeks and we got regular levels of rain again, could things just rebound?
That's a great question. And it sort of depends on where the apples are and how old the trees are. And, if they're in light soil or heavy soil and how the trees are currently performing. So if you're in a dry area, your soil is light, the soil doesn't retain water very well, those trees are feeling the impacts much earlier and much more severely. But there's some places where, there's still pretty things are still going okay. So those crops might be fine and those orchards may be okay. But certainly if we don't get anything in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, I think people are going to start feeling extremely stressed. Well, they're feeling stressed now,
Yes.
but it's going to feel a little bit more like, okay, what does this look like for the overall crop? And how are we going to get through this? And then what does this mean for my orchards next year and in years to come?
If things do rebound and the fruit does ripen properly and you get a good yield, regardless of what we've had this past month or so, is it possible the fruit could be sweeter because it's had that, that kind of intensification of, if you will, like, when you boil off water maple syrup, it becomes sweeter.
That's a great question. Certainly in the fall, when apples are ripening, if there's too much water, they can become less sweet. So I think we've all had the experience of maybe having an apple that doesn't have a lot of flavor because maybe during harvest there was way too much rain and those sugars were not as concentrated. So it is potentially possible that, yeah, some of the fruit could be sweeter because of this. But I think that would develop more in September and October, closer to ripening when the fruit's really turning red. At this point, they're still pretty small and green and hard.
Mm.
So there's lots of time still for those sugars to develop. Or, potentially if we get too much rain, if this trend reverses and all of a sudden in the fall we're facing too much rain, it could definitely have the opposite effect.
Well, I hope you get just the right amount of rain. But we know that with climate change, conditions have been unpredictable and they have been extreme one way or the other in the last few years. You mentioned that some of your growers are considering irrigation. Are members of your association maybe thinking about other contingency plans to deal with climate change?
Absolutely. So there's all kinds of factors that affect the fruit. There's rain, so too much or too little. There's temperature. We've had issues in climate change with late spring frosts, which of course happened during the beautiful apple blossom season. But if we get a frost and those blossoms are impacted or they die, we can lose the entire crop. A couple of years ago, we were on here talking about the polar vortex, which
Yeah.
took out all the peach crop and had impacts on apple and peach trees across the valley. So there's all kinds of stuff that we're dealing with, but there's all kinds of solutions that we're looking at. So whether it's irrigation or tile drainage for water issues, you can invest in large fans for frost mitigation, overhead irrigation that can sprinkle water on the trees to help impact some of those high and low temperatures. There's even sunshade, like shade for apples, so that apples don't get sunburned, because just like you and I, apples can get sunburned if they have too much heat and too many UV rays. So there are lots of strategies. And of course, we work with our partners in government to help growers invest in those, because a lot of them, as you can imagine, are pretty expensive when you're growing fruit and when you're dealing with such unpredictable crop returns and unpredictable weather patterns.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Oh, I was so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.